All right, so now that we've got all the formalities out of the way and people seem to settle, let's talk about what we're talking about. So, why do we need a data structure for food? Anyone?
Well, if we're going to operationalize data about food, we need standards in the same way that we need standards for knowing, how to drive down the street. I mean, to enable commerce, I think is and education and all the things that come with the exchange of information.
And the word ontology is in here. Explain to us what an ontology is, perhaps. Someone.
Okay, I'll go again.
The professor will tell.
So, ontologies are special vocabularies, and the reason that they're special is because we can enable semantic precision with the words. So we can define links, synonymous links, and we can define relationships between terms, not just a taxonomy, which would be a hierarchy of, example, kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, species, but we can define relationships between terms within taxonomies. So I might have a kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, species of fish, and a taxonomy of water types, fresh, salty, whatever, brackish, flowing, and I might say this fish spawns in this kind of water, and now I've linked elements from this taxonomy to this taxonomy, and I'm enabling all kinds of artificial intelligence because I've established the named linkages between the terms.
Closer to food, if you say feta, I understand it's a type of cheese, and Greek is a type of cuisine, and that feta belongs to Greek cuisine. You can make Greek salad, and when you see Greek salad, it's a Greek and feta cheese.
Right.
So. And to answer your question, I think it's a context sport. We all are trying to build solutions for people to do everyday things like cook or shop or figure out what's good for them. And because we have so many companies doing that, we need to be able to communicate at a level that the consumer doesn't see, and that's why we need standards. And ontology is just, like Betty said, a vocabulary for us to talk to each other.
So here's the motivation. Every other part of life has gotten simpler. It's gotten digitized, music, movies, taxi cabs, and they figured out ways to talk amongst themselves. And that was a relatively simpler problem. Food is more complex. There's millions of SKUs of different foods. There's all the nutrition aspects. There's health aspects. There's recipe inspiration. There's how do you do it. There's how do you tie that to the new smart appliances. There's many different parts of this that are really deep. That means that it's going to take a bunch of us working together to do it. And if we're going to work together on data, then the data, if it matches up, we can do a lot better job. We can get there a lot faster. We can kind of make it interoperate instead of having to remap every single time. And so this is part of the underpinnings. So the consumer doesn't need to know about this. They shouldn't. But if we are going to work together, this is where this kind of level of technical discussion can make a big difference in how fast we bring things to market.
All right, so this is the underlying layer of how we're going to talk about food between different companies for computers, right? So anything that's going to happen like on the AI front, or I don't know, if I'm opening up an API, this seems important. Where else will this affect us, or where else does this matter, having this underlying layer?
Well, first of all, you can do AI without having ontologies standards per se, but you're not going to really be able to communicate all of your wonderful data and information that you've accumulated with anybody else, because they're going to do their own AI, right? And so creating a standard will enable the exchange of this and more broad-based AI. But one of the things that I think is a beautiful outcome here is this idea that we can link food spanning, as it emerges out of the ground, even before it gets put into the ground, ag, harvest, distribution, storage, processing, diet, and ultimately health outcomes, right? This whole value chain. And by virtue of doing that, then we can actually make, data-informed policy, which is something that doesn't actually exist today.
So let's walk through a couple different use cases on how this affects the human. Make us care about it. So Kevin, we'll start with you, an example from you, and then we'll just run down and get a fun example for everyone, from everyone.
Great. So the smart kitchen, if it's just remote control and can turn things off and on, and you've got some screens and stuff, that's okay. But that doesn't really get dinner on the table. That doesn't really advance cooking. You need to start to introduce the food, all the information about the food that's going to help that journey, that's going to help activate the kitchen, that's going to start to be able to tie it together into something that's simple. There's a lot of work underneath to make it simple for the consumer so they can actually execute it. So that information about the food as it comes down the supply chain of I only want locally sourced, organic XYZ, that turns out to be data. And if that data can smoothly pass between the different parties and then get all the way to the kitchen, now your kitchen's going to empower the consumer in a way it could never do before. It's going to put that information where someone really cares about it. And so that's, for me, what's very exciting is that how do we unlock that information, and the end goal is empower the consumer. And when the consumer can see things, people are going to make better food.
So, Kevin's got essentially this amazing set of interfaces for making, not having to be able to speak what, I often refer to as the hyper FML, or, the hyper food markup language, right? It's not really a markup, it's an ontology, but nobody knows what an ontology is, so I just compare it to HTML. You don't have to know HTML in order to surf the web, right? And so what we're doing is, so we actually just signed a deal with USDA for our lab to essentially redo the food composition database for the United States and several of the USDA databases, so that we can begin to link together many of these research databases that are happening across the food spectrum. And you'll be hearing from folks later, blockchain and things like this. So these are the kinds of companies in the supply chain that need to be able to tag food with attributes about the phenotype of the food, or the process that was used to create the food or harvest it, or of course geo and time tagging, so that you can trace food back. And having that kind of common language that can exchange between partners, I think is going to be really, really important.
All right, so why should you care? I think we come from a different perspective. We straddle food and health and wellness. I personally believe that the human lifespan is 120 years, and everybody can live up to 120 years free of chronic conditions, free of mental disease, and they can live happily. But they need to have the right lifestyle, and a lot of it is food, what you eat, how you eat. So a lot of it is personalization of the food based on who you are, and that's understanding your biochemistry, your microbiome, your genome, your allergies, your location, how old you are, whatnot. All of this is data. Now, granted, there is data around food, there is data around people, but if the ontologies work, we can understand and link up all this data. Ultimately, eating well and living long is an information problem. I need to make a decision, what should I eat tonight or tomorrow that tastes good, that I like, that's in my budget, that fits my my preferences, what's in my fridge and all that stuff. We can solve this problem. It's a very simple problem. The complexity comes from the amounts of data we have to aggregate and the different source we got to take it, so we can actually serve you that suggestion of this is what you should eat, and manage that proactively. I think if we solve that problem, we can eradicate chronic conditions. Now, that's something to care about.
I just want to add on. I love the work that Victor's doing. I don't know if 120 is the magic number. I'd certainly like to make it to 120. I'm going to aim for 120 as well. So I just came from the International Society of Nutrigenomics, Nutrigenetics conference, right? And we have now commercial tests for over 45 different genes, right, that have dietary interventions, so you can optimize your diet around that, right, and your physical activity, and your sleep and stress. So it's even beyond food, right? It's like if I had this much sleep and I have these genes and I'm going to do this activity this weekend, maybe there are things that I should be eating to improve. But health, while that is great, I think most of us, the vast majority of us, eat for flavor, right? We eat because we want deliciousness, right? I tell all my students all the time, like, food science, it's the only science that's delicious. And, you know, I have a graduate student right now who's her whole mission in life is to digitize the concept of flavor. Like, what does it mean? We've digitized light, we've digitized sound. What about digitizing aroma? How do I explain, you know, when you used to say, how do I know that orange that I'm looking at, you call orange, or do you call it red, or do you call it, anyway, we have that flavor, we have that problem now with flavor that we never had before, and I think ontologies are going to help us get there. So we have this endpoint of flavor, and we've got these sort of guardrails on the road of health and sustainability. And when we're annotating for both of those, it can kind of keep us on the road and help us down the path that we really want to get to, which is this delight.
That does sound delightful. It sounds awful, though, getting to there. Like, so we're having this like crazy discussion about ontologies and data. This seems like a really hard problem to solve and categorize, especially because it seems hard to see a business model around it. So you're a professor. That feels like your mission in life and something that you do as a professor. But what about other companies who are helping here or want to take, I mean, I can see taking advantage of it, but how do you build business models while trying to build this?
So, I'll give some props to Matt. Matt is the guy when it comes to this, the guy in the world that does this. And so I've been going to his conference, as a business person, because to unlock a lot of this magic, to unlock, as you start to you want to personalize, and we're doing a ton of personalization right now based on the nutrients that are on the side of the package, and he's about to revamp that. That's great. But when you start getting down into how do I match this food with this biome, with this sort of genome, with all of this, it's going to take some science. It's going to take some real deep data down there. Now, the consumer doesn't want to know any of that. But someone's going to have to do it, and it's going to be a big business, and it's going to be important. And everyone who's participating in that, if you're making a food and your competitor's food lists all of this data in the right format so it can be ingested and suggested, then their food's going to get on the table and yours isn't. So everyone who thought that they were in the business of baking something and putting it in a bag and then putting it on a shelf, that business is going to change like every other business that gets digitized. And so this is that map that is going to start to do it. We have to start with the killer apps, though. There's a bigger vision. You have to have a path, and a way that you do it. But that's the discussions we're having over beers at these conferences is like, what are those sooner killer apps? And so that there's definitely a lot. As the new USDA data comes out, we will absolutely be using that in our business.
I mean, I think you ultimately solve for a consumer pain point, and the consumer pays for it or a business pays for it. Because we deal with health, it might be an insurance company paying for it because you extend somebody's life. It doesn't matter. You solve for a consumer pain point, and I think that's how you make business out of it. Just an analogy. If you think about music, before Pandora came and essentially created the genome of a song, put like 70, 80 attributes for each song. There wasn't a really good music recommendation. Now Spotify, I don't even think about it. Like you put Spotify on and immediately, they start suggesting. And I think we can do the same thing with food. Ultimately the consumer is going to pay for whatever you're solving, whatever customer pain point will be. What should I have for dinner, or how do I cook that, or whatever it is. And it might not be the customer. It might be bundled into their grocery shopping. It might be bundled into their refrigerator subscription service. Whatever it is, but you solve for that problem, and then the data is just the enabler. But we have to have the data.
Good one, Victor.
So in fact, Pandora and Spotify both use the Music Brains ontology to describe music, right? So I think that's a great analogy. And if we think about it, right, and we think about the fact that actually I don't have to listen to music, right? I don't have to buy a book. I don't have to watch Netflix, but I got to eat. And all of us, we all have to eat every day. And when you think about that and the scale and what we're talking about building here, I was walking around my university saying ontologies, and people were like, and I wasn't getting any traction. And then suddenly I said, these things we're talking about the Internet of Food here. And people start saying, what's that? Internet of Food, that's interesting. And as we started working through the model, realizing actually this language, this underpins what will be, right. We know that by 2020 data emerging from Internet of Things devices will be larger than the World Wide Web, right? And now when you think that a vast portion, if not the majority, of those IoT devices are going to be on the farm, in the soil, like on the plants, in the transportation, reporting about what? Food that's in flux, right? And devices about health, right? So we can expect that the Internet of Food will be essentially orders of magnitude larger than the Internet of Things. That's massive. So in terms of business opportunities, that's massive.
Okay, so let's then talk about the killer apps, because I love how we keep going weird deep tech or big picture thinking, but I also want us to be like, oh, this is why this matters. So we'll start actually, I thought this was kind of a cool killer app. You talked briefly about, as part of the USDA contract that you have, thinking about I can never say these words, bioavailability of certain food or certain nutrients in a food.
Right.
So can you talk a little bit about that? Right.
So part of our sort of rethinking of the food composition database is actually organizing food in a new digital model that we're calling a food phenotype, right? So the way that you can phenotype a person or a plant or a bacteria, I can phenotype a yogurt or a dough or a lasagna. And this idea that not only are the chemical components important, but so are the biological components. So I just consumed maybe a milk fat globule membrane, or I just consumed, right, which part of the plant or animal or thing did I just consume? And it's going to have bioactive properties. At the same time, I need to consider the physical structure. How tightly bound are those chemicals? So if I eat some broccoli and I eat some steak and they both have the same amount of iron, guess what? I'm going to absorb more iron from that steak because it's more bioavailable. And the structure of that steak is what makes it more viable, even if it's the same amount of iron. And that's going to be important for making informed nutrition choices.
So this is going to look like steak. Steak goes with cows, so you're tied to all the cows out there. It's also tied to meat, and as part of this, the nutritional thing is going to be iron, and certain people can get this much iron from it. I have no idea if there's genetic components to how much iron we could absorb. But I'm just trying to illustrate how complicated
it's totally complicated, and you may have other genetic polymorphisms that say don't eat too much meat because X, Y, or Z, right? Or maybe you've got ethical issues with eating meat, and so we have to find other ways to.
So this is a great example where think of this from the industry point of view. So let's say that there's someone that's doing microbiome tests and genetic tests, and they're getting indications of you should do this, more of this, less of this, that kind of thing. So having a good standard way to be able to communicate that to, let's say someone like us, and we're suggesting what's for dinner, right? So if we can now take a really complicated thing, right, and find the right narrow passageway to transmit that information so that it can be interoperable. Now if I know that you should be doing things that make sure you absorb vitamin D, and that means you have to have fat at the same time that you're having vitamin D because you're vitamin D deficient, and that was in your profile, well, guess what? I can use that. I'm going to throw some creme fraiche on that. Right? So this is a very practical thing. Now, again, the consumer doesn't need to understand all this complexity. And in fact, none of us needs to understand all of it. But for any of us to be able to progress and go deep and do something meaningful and then make it available, it's going to need these APIs, these layers, just like networking to make your Wi-Fi talk to your router, talk to your ISP. We had to standardize that. And then to make it go faster, you improved it. And so it's the same thing. It's playing out here in food. Food's pretty complex, so if we get paralyzed by it being too complex and don't make any progress, well, then that's bad for all of us. I think there's some really good killer apps like this, which can be made very simple in terms of the way they're presented to the consumer.
Yeah, let me tell you my dream of a killer app. I call it the virtual nutritionist, and something, if we execute well, we'll probably have in 50 years. But it's essentially understanding you completely. I think pinpoint personalization is what's the killer app here, and it's the ability to tell someone in advance what they should be eating that matches their flavor needs, and where they are, and everything else. But also, so here's a few kind of sci-fi things that can happen. First of all, you can have nanobots measuring the biochemistry of your blood in real time and communicating that that information. So you know, for example, how much sugar you have in your blood, different monosaccharides and whatnot. If you're diabetic, that is invaluable information because that may mean you can eat that pizza. You know, if you have, you know, the ability and your body can process it. So that's one thing. You can have your genome sequenced, and, you know, different genotypes, you know, eat differently. You know, if you think about it, people from the Mediterranean eat different foods than people from South Africa, than people from Vietnam. And over centuries, the genotype has evolved to process those particular foods, right? You know, and there is no one good way that you should eat. And some of it is genotype, some of it is microbiome that you live, that depends on the place you are in the world, the season, the age and whatnot. So we know all that. And then we know things about you, like you're on 3rd Avenue and 6th Street in Seattle at 2 o'clock in the afternoon. We can start suggesting to you, saying, oh, based on the biochemistry, microbiome, genome, all that stuff, this is a dish that you can get in the restaurant next door, and that's the price. Now, that is the type of personalization that I think is the killer app. And that's kind of the thing that we're building.
And what was the time frame you set on this?
I say 50 years, but, you know, I hope 10. You know, there's a lot of tech that needs to be sold, but all of the tech is available now. There are things that can measure your biochemistry in real time. There's genome sequencing, there's microbiome sequencing. All of this is there, just needs to be tied together.
So I'm going to go back to flavor for the killer app.
Please, because I'm sitting here going, I don't want to be told I need to eat more salad.
Yeah.
I want to be told I need to eat ice cream.
I like to tell people, you know, when they tell me to eat more leafy greens, I say, go to kale. Like I'm tired of people telling me to eat more kale. And for me, actually, it's not good, right? I'm what's colloquially known as a stone thrower. I like to make kidney stones, and guess what? Kale's full of bad stuff that makes me make more kidney stones, right? Oxalic acid. So I stay away from kale, and I love spinach, but I don't eat that much of it. But really, it's about flavor and getting that sensory experience that you want, and being able to say, in the same way that I can tell Spotify or Pandora or whatever, you know, play some. I can say, in fact, I have a playlist for instrumental funk, right? And I can say that, right? And boom, it comes in, and I can dial it in a little bit more. Well, I want to be able to say some same kinds of genres about food, but now it's bounded by my ethics around sustainability or treatment of animals or desired health characteristics or these. And so what's going to have to happen, and what I think the killer app needs to do, is to be able to make those ingredient substitutions or processing substitutions. Oh, you know, you don't want to consume that much. Well, we're not going to fry it. We're going to bake it, or, you know, these kinds of things, but still give you that flavor outcome that you want.
All right, so we've moved all the way from ontologies to flavor, and this was a great panel. Everybody give these guys a round of applause. Thank y'all.
Thanks so much.